We're now going to take a look at the new displacement mapping features. And this scene that you're looking at right now, it can be found in the project content folder called Terrain Displacement. And what it is just a standard terrain, low resolution to start with right now. And it has a mixed material on it, and what we're going to do is displace just this rocky part. Now, neither one of these materials has a bump map on it at the moment. If we take a look at the material, we can see color productions for material 1 and 2, and I have them named just grass and rocks. So if we move over to the bump, we're going to create a function to force the bump outward and really just look at the normal. So right-click, edit function, or you can control-click on the preview to open the function editor. And I'm going to add in a constant node, select the constant number, and enter a value of 1. Now, pretty much every single number output in view is between -1 and +1. And with displacement mapping, anything beyond those values will be completely clipped. So we're going to do 1 as our maximum, and I'm going to connect the bump and the displacement. Now, the displacement output is the new output. Bump and displacement are now completely separate. And by default, loading in existing functions, you'll notice that the displacement will be connected to this bump. In order for that to work correctly, first let's go ahead and turn on displacement mapping. And what we have is add bump mapping to displaced surface, and then the bump depth. You'll also see that the bump production is now called displacement production. And the bump scale is relative to the displacement scale. So if we want to increase the depth of the displacement, we change the depth amount, and then the bump depth runs separately. So if you have different connections, or if you want a blend between the two, because for the most part, just displacing a terrain like this, just a standard terrain, you would really need to add a bump to equal out the shadows. So I'm going to force this depth amount to, let's go ahead and type in a value of 10. And the new option is to control the direction. We have along normal, horizontal, vertical, normal map, and custom mode. Along normal is the default. If you're not familiar with normals, they're basically the direction a polygon face is facing. So really, if we were to take a look at the ground plane, it's completely flat, and if we look at this for the gizmo, the Z pointing up, this would be the normal direction, the normal. So it's perpendicular to the face of the polygon. And that is the direction that now controls displacement when you have it along normal. So on steep areas of terrains, the displacement will come out the side. So we'll go back into that terrain, take a look, and we can also reevaluate material distribution after the displacement, which is normally suggested. That was there before. Another new option is smoothing, which will smooth out rough areas of the displacement and kind of acts like the smallest feature of certain fractals. So let's take a look at a render just kind of forcing this out, just this rocky surface. Now, because I have such a high amount set, and we're using a very low resolution terrain, we're going to see some really bad looking shadows, which is no different than normal, just because there's no real interesting bump. But what you will notice is that the displacement direction is going and facing outward towards the normal. So over here on the left, we can see it being displaced up, and then along the side over here, it's going out a lot more. So let's go ahead and let's just reduce this to 5 and look at a new render. And I also want to make a note, if you're one of the users that happens to be using one of the first releases of Vue 8, and maybe even later, depending on what changes are made, you may want to create a keyboard shortcut for the Purge Memory command. Found or file, pull down here. What that's going to do is trash the displacement that's stored in your memory, because with the current version I'm using, which is just a few days before release, there are some update issues, and if you don't purge the memory after making changes to the displacement, it will not make changes to the displacement. So now that definitely looks a little bit better. The tearing, or what appears to be tearing, it's really just the shadows. The reason they're so jagged is because all terrains are triangulated. There's no quad polys, it's all triangles. If you take a look at a wireframe view, you'll be able to see that a little better. So I am going to open up the material, go to the mix, and increase the smooth blending strip to 100%. And that's going to cut down some of the displacement once it starts blending into the other surface. So now you can see it's not nearly as harsh as it was before. The shadows are still an issue, and that's almost always going to be the way it is, unless you have an intense bump really smoothing out the surface that's somewhat matched to the displacement. And that's with the normal ray tracing mode. What we can do if we actually want to work with something that's going to process very quickly, in this case, if we take a look at the terrain, we're running at 128 by 128, a very low resolution terrain. So if I double click on the sunlight, let's edit the shadows. We're going to click Use Shadow Map, Soft Shadows, set it to Auto Size, and that's really going to help take care of those jagged edges. Now in this case it did present a new problem, which is the shadows just look kind of terrible. So what we can do is just slightly increase the resolution, open the terrain editor, and I'm going to use a little diffuse erosion. What I can also do is turn it up to 512 and then back down to 256 to sample it higher, sample it lower, to smooth it out a little quicker. I'm going to make a few additional changes to the lighting, sunlight and the shadows. If I select the sunlight, I'm going to change the softness up to 15, which isn't going to require a really high quality boost or sampling boost because it's a shadow map rather than ray traced. I'm going to turn off the auto size and just set a manual value of 1024 and set the sampling boost to 1. And then I'm going to go to the atmosphere editor and just change this over to the standard lighting model, and we'll move it a little more towards the sunlight, around 70, just to get it to render a little bit quicker. And now for the most part all that jaggedness from the shadow is gone. There's still a few areas that might need to be improved on. But that's because there's also a lot of stretching in this terrain. But you can really see the displacement a little bit better. And I'm going to go ahead and just look at it from the side. And this definitely makes for an interesting displacement. Now, I'm going to make a modification to the filter. So if we go to the bump, add new key point in the center, and I'm going to just adjust this curve. And the overall output is still 1, so it should be pretty consistent. But it is a way to balance out the ending and starting point, since some changes have been made to the way filters will clip If I was to drag out and take this endpoint and really twist it around so that it's curving too much, and depending on what clamping mode you're using, it can produce some very interesting results. So the default mode is along normal. Let's go ahead and switch it over to horizontal only, which will just displace along the X and Y. So if your Z-axis is up, there will be no displacement. Now, depending on the settings you have, sometimes using the preset isn't always the best route. There are ways to customize it a little bit more. In this case, it seems to be working okay. Let's switch this over to a more interesting looking displacement, something that has variation. First, we'll switch it over to vertical and take a look, and just see that the displacement is going upward. And an upward displacement is really no different than anything that could be done directly within modifying the terrain. So I'm going to open up, edit the function, and because I have it set to vertical only, what we can see is there is a new output called displace direction. Because of the size of the text, displace output for just the displacement and the displace direction look about the same, but one is a number output and then the other is a vector output. You can see this is an auto connection setup that's connected to the normal options input node with the XYZ product math node vector operation, and the direction of the displacement is controlled by a value of 1, with 0 being the limiter. So 0x on y, and then z is 1. So horizontal only is 1 on the x, 1 on the y, and 0 on the z. Which if we change it to horizontal only and take a look, it will automatically update that. If we switch this over to custom, we can now define anything we want and connect this to any vector whatsoever. So one thing I suggest is if you're having problems with some tearing, because you're completely limiting an axis, you can reduce one of the amounts rather than completely removing it. So if we wanted horizontal only, we could use 1, 1, and then on the z, instead of using 0, we could use a value of 0.1. So it's a very minimal displacement, but there's still a little bit there in case you run into tears. So let's go ahead and switch this over. I'm going to make a noise node, make terrain Perlin noise, and then take the wavelength and bring it down to 0.5, and take our scale and bring it up to 15. So this should be fairly interesting. I may have to reduce the scale or the depth amount and then increase the scale because we are in the world mapping mode. So I'm going to take the depth down to 2 and the bump depth down to 2. Go back into the function and just set our scale to 35. And the output of the terrain Perlin noise is much smaller than other nodes, so I will have to increase the scale a little and just make it slightly larger. We'll do this with the wavelength, bringing it up to a value of 10 on all the axes. And what I'm going to do is take the bump scale and set that to 0.5. Or actually, we'll go ahead and use 0.7. And now we're on that custom mode. And what I want to do is open it up. So we'll set the offset to 1. So this is going to be the same as along normal, because we're connected to the normal options. So it's still a very minimal displacement. We can see it looks a little better. It's a little more interesting. We've got areas going in and out. I'm going to switch this over to a fractal. instead of using a noise node, which is going to automatically set it up to a terrain Perlin noise. And I'm not going to use rotation at the moment. And now we have something a little more interesting. We can start to see the bump making up for the lack of geometry that's part of this terrain. But the behavior is a lot different when you're working with procedural terrains. And when you have a sculpted 3D terrain, there's more geometry to work with. And you can end up with a much lower resolution standard terrain with some 3D geometry to make up for some of those areas. So let's take a look at this with a procedural terrain. And what we can do is select the terrain and edit the object. And up at the top, we can convert it to a procedural. Now, before I do this, I'm actually going to go to the material and just turn off displacement mapping. And then go ahead and convert, and hopefully avoid a crash. So, what I'm going to do instead, and since I just reloaded this, I do need to turn off the displacement mapping. I'm going to purge the memory, making sure that displacement is not part of it. We can go up to the top and copy the object. And now we could also just convert this over to a procedural again, and hopefully the purge memory worked. But I'm not going to rely on that, so I'm going to create procedural terrain, go ahead and scale it up to match the approximate size, edit the object, I go ahead and reset, turn off zero edges, go to the procedural, reset the function, and then we can paste in. And I do need to scale this down to the same size as the other terrain, 256. Looks like maybe it's not working. Go ahead and try that again. Forming another copy and paste. And because that didn't end up working, what I'm going to do is change that new procedural to a standard, then paste it in, and then convert that to a procedural, which did work the first time. So in case you're having issues, it worked the first time, didn't work this time. This is actually the part of the training that I did put off the last for recording because of a lot of these issues. What I did find worked this time was I turned off the displacement mapping in the material, saved the scene, then purged the memory again, and then was able to convert the original terrain over to a procedural. So it's just a memory issue. Hopefully it's something could get fixed. So now we can turn back on the displacement mapping, and we're going to end up with something that looks a little bit better. So I'm going to reposition the camera, and we'll go ahead and take a look at a render. Now, because we're using shadow mapping, and the way procedural terrains render by default with fast shadows on, you don't really get a lot of depth. We can see the detail is much higher, is a much higher amount of geometry within the terrain. So now that we're not using a standard terrain, I'm going to turn off shadow maps. We're just going to use the original ray tracing, which will give us a much different look, harsher shadows, and we'll be able to see the difference. So with the softness quality off, we can also see around the edges much harsher shadows, and also the possibility of there being holes in the terrain, which is one thing I've noticed with procedural terrains, at least at the moment. The shadow maps or softness quality can help remove that, but it is a problem you can run into. So let's go ahead and start with purely procedural terrain, I'm just going to copy this material. We can delete the terrain, add in a procedural, edit the object, turn off zero edges, and I'm going to paste this material, and then take the terrain and stretch it, just moving it up on the z-axis to give us a little more scale. So we can see with the procedural terrain, there is some tearing in some of these sections where you can see through the terrain. Not a good thing. For the most part, we can start to see the displacement. The scale might be a little off because a standard terrain and procedural terrain do exist in different scales, and the scale outputs do not match. So sometimes different functions won't carry over. Now, so that we can see and focus a little more on just the displacement and also take a look at a couple of other things, I'm going to modify the procedural and remove some of the roughness. Now there's another thing, and that has to do with the seed. This isn't always going to be an issue, but I have found sometimes you will run into problems using the seed node with ridiculous calculation times and lots of memory usage for simple displacements. The seed is an offset, but it works a little different from just an offset. It works in the reverse direction. So if you do need to keep this seed offset amount, because you like the terrain you have, you can copy the values from the seed, paste them into the origin, and then if it's a positive, you just put a negative in front of it. If it's a negative, remove the negative dash and make it positive, and then it'll match up. The only thing that will happen is it will change the z scale of the terrain. You might have to just stretch it up a little bit. Other than that, pretty much preserved. But I'm just going to go ahead and remove that. I'm also going to change over to the gradient, use with rotation, click OK. So this is just a preview render of what it looks like, and you can see that terrain noise making a slight displacement. I'm going to make a few changes, and I'm going to stretch up the terrain a little bit more and modify the bump. I also want to make sure the display's direction is correct. And because we have a procedural terrain, we don't necessarily have to use a complex function. If I change it over to the terrain Perlin noise, and I'm going to set the scale to 40, so now we're just using a noise node. Take the billows and ridge amount, set it to 0, increase smooth area altitude, add a little bit of distortion. And what I also want to do is take the filter, and I'm going to add a new key point and bring down that first, or the part on the right, and just kind of make a little more of an interesting filter for this. So we have a little more of an intense displacement. There are a few errors with the shadows. But I do want to make a note, and that is, if we go to File and Options, and under General Preferences, there's a new option to limit the displacement mapping memory usage. I've got mine set pretty low because I'm recording. Normally, a value of 3 gigs works pretty well, but that largely depends on how close you are to the terrain. The geometry of the terrain and the displacement, so whether you're using a terrain or not, the overall geometry, especially with the procedural terrain, depending on the type of object you're using, it will change. But for the most part, procedural terrain, The closer the camera is, the higher the displacement will be. When you're using an object with the dynamic subdivision amount, so if I just go ahead really quick, create a cube, bake it to polygons, and we look at the options for meshes. If you have dynamic subdivision on, the closer the camera gets to the object, the more the geometry is increased. So that would provide a better displacement. It works the same way with the procedural terrain. And can also behave the same way when you have a 3D terrain. Now, because there is some interference with the mixed material, I'm going to go ahead and open up the material, swap out material 1 and 2, and then switch the main mix over to a simple material. And that way we just have one with a displacement, and we don't have to worry about multiple materials, and we can really just look at the main displacement. Now there's still a little bit of tearing in some of the areas, and it does seem to happen more on the edges, and really depending on what your total scale is. Displacement mapping really tends to work best with a standard terrain using 3D geometry and sculpting it. Those two in combination with each other seem to work pretty well. Let's go ahead and just take a look at changing the mode. I'm going to set this to horizontal only. And one thing you'll notice is overlapping. Depending on how close the geometry is to each other and as it's being displaced, what you're going to see is sometimes cutoffs, harsh edges. So there's an option to displace outward only, or you could force the extension beyond 1, starting at maybe 3, and that will displace it outward a little bit more, and that can sometimes help remove those overlaps, because the entire surface is then being displaced outward for the most part. It's another way to displace outward, but you're forcing the extension, so you're extending the overall geometry output. Let's go ahead and take a look with some higher settings. Let's bring the depth up to 10. And I have made just a few modifications. I did reset that filter, and I'm going to take the Z and bring it to 0.4, because I did have that brought down to 0.2. And you can really see along the edge of the terrain how that overlapping is being affected. So let's turn off the force extension. And I'm going to reduce the total output and the depth down to 4. And I do want to switch that over. I'm going to use vertical. It looks like maybe that did not refresh earlier. And we can see just that upward displacement. Of course, it would be easier just to run that on the procedural since it's just going up. Now, along normal is the default. If you do want to use a global system, you can set it to custom. And if it doesn't have the nodes you need, you can add in the normal options and set it to world, and then connect that displace direction to that. If you wanted to work with the custom mode along the normal, then you would work with the object. I'm not going to restrict any of the axes, but opening it up like this, I'm also going to turn off the option to add the bump to the surface, because we are using a procedural terrain, so we don't really need it. And now it's basically working more with the world coordinate system, although I do want to note the object mode does lock the displacement to the terrain's position. So if you were to take the terrain and rotate it, in the world mode it's going to move through the displacement, and the direction could change depending on what's being restricted. So if you're using the object mode, that will make sure that when you have terrains that are flipped over or rotated slightly, that they do stay in place.